This is a chapter review for Vinland Saga 196, Thousand Year Voyage, Part 5. Last chapter, we had an exploration of how an isolated conversation that excludes the other party can lead to the growth of fear and distrust. So I expected this chapter to demonstrate how an open discussion is necessary for this problem to be solved. I specifically said at the end of last review that I expected for all to go well and in the right direction until one mistake ruins it. And I specifically expected Ivar to end up using the sword that was now officially in play. Well, if you read this chapter, you may know how accurate those predictions were. So, let's just get into it, and starting with this cover page here. We have a focus on Nisquaji'j and a very reluctant looking Bug-Eyes as interpreters for the conversation between the Ilnu and the Norse. So we have Bug-Eyes being asked to assist with interpreting after bringing the Gitpi tribe over to join the Thing. Bug-Eyes once again undersells himself as an interpreter like he did before, and he's scared of bearing that responsibility in such an important moment. And Ivar calls him out, saying that he could easily fabricate the translation to say what best suits the anti-armament faction. And Bug-Eyes hilariously is like, that's a great idea, can I just make it up? Which I love Bug-Eyes for. But Nisquaji'j interrupts here to assert that she and Bug-Eyes can do it. They can be interpreters here. She specifically says they can exchange, well, I'm going to try to pronounce this as best as I can, Lisuti or Tlisuti or something along those lines, which Bug-Eyes very hesitantly but accurately translates to language. So again, we can see Bug-Eyes saying that he's not a good translator, but when somebody asks what a word is, he's the one with the answer. He undersells himself, but he is capable. But Nisqua says that she understands the importance of talking and promises that the Ilnu will do their best to talk and understand. And Thorfinn is very happy about this. He's just happy to hear this, and he kindly requests her help. Bug-Eyes ultimately agrees to help here, but he says that no matter what happens here, it is absolutely not his fault. And Bug-Eyes, let's certainly hope that you still feel this way after the events of this chapter. So Thorfinn then initiates the tobacco ceremony, and I absolutely love this moment. He uses the pipe here that was introduced all the way back in chapter 3 and passed on to him in chapter 176, and he initiates this tobacco smoking ceremony with the Gippy tribe. So we get some context here that this ceremony is done in native tradition as a symbolic gesture that promises not to lie to each other. And although Thorfinn very, very clearly cannot hang, Gippy is happy to see that he understands their customs and he feels that he can trust him. Polmuk agrees that Thorfinn's a great guy, and he appreciates the gesture still, even though he was the one who taught Thorfinn how to actually use the pipe. So Thorfinn had to learn a little bit here, which makes a lot of sense. Smoking was, like they said in the previous page, smoking was not something that was a custom in like Europe. This is something that was spread from the introduction of the North American native people to the rest of the world. So, after all of this, after the ceremony has concluded, Gitpi addresses the rest of the settlers here. But before he does that, we can see Misek looking on distrustfully as he exhales the smoke. Gitpi thanks the Norse for inviting the tribe to join in on the conversation, and prefaces that Nisquaji'j had explained the general situation with the settlers beforehand. He expresses their concern and empathy for the missing Markland settlers and prays for their safe return. As Thorfinn said before, Gitpi tells them that their tribe was completely unaware of the incident in Markland, and that it had likely involved a distant tribe that doesn't even speak the same language as the Gitpi. He concludes his statement by restating the tribe's collective desire to get along with the Norse and learn and prosper together. We can see the settlers received this very well off of tone alone, considering that they have no idea what Gitpi just said. After being pressured to do so, we have Bug-Eyes working with Nisquaji'j to translate what Gitpi had said. After fully translating, the settlers are happy and relieved, especially Bug-Eyes, who is acting as if he wasn't scared himself. But one interesting little note here as we're going through, Bug-Eyes has his hair down here in this like weird way that almost makes him look like Hild. Now, the hair is down like this because we can see he was like getting all sweaty from the hardcore translating session that took place. But the fact that it makes him look like Hild almost makes me think this is kind of a joke from Yukimura, like a parody of Hild's forgiveness, where Bug-Eyes has his moment of growth where he's let go of his anxiety. I just think that's a funny idea, even though it probably wasn't intentional. But then we have Ivar, Uggi, and Stork reacting. So Ivar gives this kind of look of disapproval here that kind of acknowledges that he has seemingly lost the debate, but he actually seems kind of content with staying silent here. He doesn't immediately go and voice his strong opinions like he usually does. He's kind of sitting back, disapproving, kind of a sore loser, I would think, from the look on his face, but I think he's kind of accepting that, like, they have resolved this to some extent. And we see Stork here as well. He's silent, but he almost looks shocked to how well the conversation just went. Because he was the one in the previous chapter kind of putting his fear front and center, saying they are scared, they are cowards, and that's why they need to be armed. And now his fears have just been completely kind of disproven here, and he likely is not only shocked, but kind of maybe having some self-introspection here, because he does come off as a kind of logical guy and not somebody who's kind of forcing his perspective to be true. So I think he's somebody who's open to hearing these ideas and having himself be disproven. However, when Thorfinn goes to ask how they feel, Uggi is the one to speak and say that the Ulnu could be lying to catch them off guard, and that Bug-Eyes' interpretation is still under question. Now, again, yes, he's not wrong. They could lie. Bug-Eyes could be trying to trick them. These are all possibilities, but Uggi is an example of why you cannot just sit there and wallow in every little possibility. Because like Thorfinn says, if he continues to doubt like this, the paranoia will be non-stop. And Thorfinn, kind of having a sigh here, is clearly burnt out of dealing with this. Because at this point, although yes, Uggi could be correct, it just seems silly with how genuine the tribe has been with them. But then, we have Misek approaching this group. Thorfinn asks in Mi'kmaq what he needs. He says "Kwe," which is asking, like, yes, what do you need? And he calls Bug-Eyes over to interpret, because he figures that Misek likely has something to say. However, as Bug-Eyes reluctantly begins to head over, Misek begins speaking before Bug-Eyes can even get there. And he's speaking in Mi'kmaq here. Misek laments how he's the only one who knows how truly barbaric the Norse are. Thorfinn, again, not understanding what he's saying, tries to ask him to wait. This time, again, in Mi'kmaq, he's trying to say this, which likely means to wait. He's trying to get him to allow the interpretation so they can have an open discussion. But Misek continues, saying that before long, the Norse will destroy the Lanu and ruin the land they hold so sacred. He says that because he's the only one who can stop them. This is the only way. And he pulls out the axe that a settler claimed was missing back in chapter 193. Thorfinn is shocked, as is everyone looking on. Einar calls out for Thorfinn and starts to come to his aid, but Thorfinn insists that it is okay and everyone needs to just stay where they are. Misek lifts the axe and Thorfinn perceives this as an attack against himself. Thorfinn questions why, but he knows he can easily deal with this if he dodges the attack and subdues Misek. Thorfinn believes that even now they can still resolve this if he stops this attack without resorting to violence. However, first blood is spilled in Vinland. Blood covers the page. Thorfinn looks on in horror and anguish, and the other settlers watch in complete shock as the axe falls to the ground, followed by Misek's severed hand. Having found his justified reason for the sword, Ivar defends Thorfinn by slicing Misek's hand off. Misek cries out in pain, and Thorfinn painfully watches the blood spill in his peaceful paradise. That was a very, very painful moment to read for me. But let's get into the analysis, and I want to start by going back to the cover page and talking about our favorite duo, Bug-Eyes and Nisquaji'j. Having these characters work together to interpret is just a great decision. It establishes a lighthearted feel to the early pages of this chapter. I said it before, but it really is refreshing to see Bug-Eyes have a real role in the story that isn't just comic relief. Even though he is very much still himself here, he's serving a purpose that isn't just jokes. And I love that as a big fan of this character. And still, talking about Bug-Eyes, Yukimura has been criticized a bit in recent chapters for reusing some art. There have been like panels of Vargar's face, for example, and I believe Stork as well in the previous chapter. There have been reused face panels and stuff with minor changes, and I can understand the criticism of that. I don't personally mind it; it doesn't bother me, but with those criticisms, though, we have Yukimura having all of these cool, like, dynamic kind of expressions and poses for Bug-Eyes here, and it's just cool to see with, this talk of, reusing art. I'm happy to see Yukimura kind of having fun with Bug-Eyes a little bit and drawing him in a lot of varied ways for fun. It's also been very satisfying to see Nisquaji'j become more and more competent with speaking Norse. It's been a kind of steady growth where we see her start to use more and more Norse words, like casually in conversation, even though she still will use some Mi'kmaq words to try to, put together the thought as a whole. She's not a complete fluent speaker yet, but kind of like Bug-Eyes, she's able to kind of dip into it more and more every time she has to talk about it. And I think that's great. And like she said to Thorfinn here, she is surprisingly sophisticated. She's able to do a lot. And I love how she grounds Bug-Eyes as well and gets him to be helpful. It's a really, really good dynamic. It almost feels like a brother-sister dynamic to me. I don't believe there's some romance being set up here. I've seen a lot of discussion about that between these two characters, and I feel like Nisquaji'j appears to be way younger than Bug-Eyes, and I don't think it makes much sense. I think this kind of brother-sister dynamic, where she is kind of the one reeling him in a bit and grounding him, I think it's a really strong dynamic that especially gives these opening pages a really light-hearted feel. But then we have the tobacco ceremony, and it is incredibly satisfying to have Thorfinn finally smoke from this pipe. Way back in chapter 3, the pipe was introduced to us by Leif, who said that this was something only a true warrior could use, and with the context of this ceremony being that smoking from this pipe is a promise of honesty, sincerity, and open communication between peoples, Leif was absolutely correct. This is completely in line with the ideals of the true warrior. The true warrior is somebody who fights without fighting. They have open discussion, and they're able to speak and have these problems be resolved through not violence, by instead openly communicating. That is core to the true warrior, and that fits in perfectly with the ceremony. And one thing I noticed going back to chapter 3, Thorfinn wondered to himself if the smoke from the pipe was yummy. Clearly, he did not find it to be yummy here. But then we have Gitpi's statement. I love how Gippy begins by expressing the tribe's concern for the safety of the Markland people, rather than starting with defensive denial of their involvement. This shows that his first concern is the situation at hand, rather than just their release from suspicion. It's specifically important, to me at least, that he tries to broaden the settlers' scope, because they are very unaware of just how large the continent is. There's such a huge distance between Markland and where they are, such that it physically cannot be the same tribe. It's just not feasible. And this is just something that the Norse are kind of very unaware of, because just how limited their scope is. To them, Vinland is this island, and anything that happens here, anything that happens on the whole continent, feels like right next door to them. And I like that his ultimate kind of main point is that they wish to live with the settlers and prosper together. Not just living peacefully, but as separate groups. This completely throws away the concern of the Norse being invaders taking land. This is even something I've seen other readers of Vinland Saga talk about, how we're almost like following the antagonists here who are taking the land from the Ulnu. And if they were approaching this in any other way, I would agree, but we have two peoples who want to integrate, benefit each other, and coexist such that they can't take land from each other's groups because they are ultimately one people. That's the end goal of this peaceful Vinland idea. Then let's get into Misek Pique. With the whole chapter up until this point showing the strength of mutual communication as it leads to genuine understanding between the two groups, Misek approaches with no intent of being heard and understood. Because of his fear and sense of duty as a spiritual leader, he does not believe anyone else needs to be consulted about what he's about to do. Not the Norse, not them, and not even his own people. This is just him taking his action with no communication. He ignorantly assumes there is nothing that needs to be said to Thorfinn, and he does not wait for a translator. And we get this absolutely gorgeous panel of a North American landscape, and it reminds us of what it's at stake. It reminds us what will ultimately happen to this land and its native people. We cannot say that he is ultimately in the wrong simply because what's going to happen. But Yukimura has made such a point to have Vinland Saga focus on doing what you can now and not living in fear of the future. That was what the whole talking about Ragnarok chapter 190 was all about. It was about how living in this fear of the future is going to ultimately lead to a less positive life. So, I think it's necessary. It's absolutely necessary that Vinland Saga brings forth the reality of what will happen to the native people of the North American continent. It has to be addressed. And this panel absolutely hits in that sense. So, although none of our settlers can understand what he is saying, it's important to note that Nisquaji'j is in earshot and watching all of this. It will be her job next chapter to help communicate what happened to the Gippy tribe through the likely ensuing chaos after how this chapter ends. I really love this panel in particular, with Misek bringing out the axe. I think just Yukimura did a solid job with the lighting and how the fabric looks and the details of Misek's face. I think this is just a brilliant panel. I absolutely love it. And honestly, the dread it communicated to me when I was reading this, it just absolutely well done. But with Misek taking out this axe, there's a lot to think about, and this is kind of the bulk of what I think really needs to be talked about this chapter. The first thing that came to my mind here was, is Misek truly attacking Thorfinn? He certainly appears to be, based on what he's saying and how he is raising the axe here. However, it's not hard to see how illogical it would be to attack Thorfinn here. Killing Thorfinn will do nothing to make the settlers leave, and it will only lead to more casualties on both sides after the deed is done. I understand Misek is desperate. He's scared. He knows what will happen to his people, and he absolutely cannot allow it. I 100% get that. But there is a much better way to handle this. There are many better ways to handle this. Even if you need to kill the leader and you think that's a good idea, there are better places to do this than during a discussion where all parties are present. So, if he's not attacking, and as I am thinking where this attack is nonsensical, what could this actually be? So, assuming Misek is truly trying to take action against the settlers, this could be him attempting to use himself as a means to bring out their savagery in front of his people. He could be seeing himself as a sacrifice, where he can kind of goad them into attacking and use them as a kind of example to show that they're savages. And in a sense, Ivar would be giving him what he wanted here. This would at least make more sense to me than him literally trying to kill Thorfinn as a means of solving the problem. If he wanted to make an example and kind of try to spark a conflict that will force them out, and he knowingly is trying to start something, then okay, I can kind of get it. If he expected to be taken down as a sort of test almost, I can somewhat get behind that. However, if he isn't trying to take action against them, and has genuinely respected the wishes of the tribe, then he may be literally trying to bury the hatchet here. I know this sounds a little crazy based on how he was acting up until this point, but hear me out. Burying the hatchet is a literal practice between hostile native tribes, and it's a symbolic gesture for making peace. And in history, the Mi'kmaq people were part of a literal burying the hatchet ceremony with the British in 1761. So it has historical tribes to the Mi'kmaq people specifically. Again, based on how he's raising the axe up against Thorfinn here, I'm not confident in this being the case. It's honestly unlikely that this theory is true. However, in the action panels of his attack, his expression at the top here does not read to me as inherently aggressive. It has some kind of feel to it where it's not exactly happy and positive, but I don't think this looks like somebody who's going for an all-out attack. But that could be a wishful reading of his face. And at the bottom panel here, his axe is above his head, but we are so focused on the axe that we can't even see his face. We can't see his expression. So potentially, he could see Ivar coming, and we're too focused on the axe, and he could be pulling back in fear to try to get his hand away. Like, that is certainly possible. Again, unlikely. However, I want this to be the case, and I'm going to get into why. This would make the first blood in Vinland come from a mix of distrust, fear, and cultural misunderstandings, creating miscommunication, which is exactly what this arc should focus on. That's exactly how this very human conflict should happen, because that is ultimately what would have caused this in history, and why this is a kind of, I guess, example of human failure, of the human condition. That is what we should see as the cause. But let's get into the first blood. After 3 years of Vinland Saga chapters, violence has returned once again. We have had peace since the end of the Baltic Sea War. And as somebody who is happy to be in these peaceful chapters, and despite knowing that this eventually would happen, it absolutely shocks to read it. The panel of this axe here, on kind of a separate note, it feels almost like a callback to chapter 28 with the slaughter of Anne's village. The panel of the axe being raised up with the blood splatter, it's very reminiscent of that. Whether or not this is an intentional callback to that, I can't say. There's a lot of differences and a lot of context differences, but it reminds me of that either way. But going down to Thorfinn's face here, we have this look of shock and anguish that just hurts to look at. To the very last moment here, he believed he could still salvage the situation, but that chance was literally snatched away from him with the swift slash of a sword. By Vinland Saga standards, this violence here of the hand being cut off is somewhat tame. Compare this to Baltic Sea War, where gruesome deaths were being shown constantly. We had an old man be crushed into like a bloody paste by a giant like boulder, and we've had people's eyes cut out, and there's so much violence in the Baltic Sea War that compared to this was way crazier. However, if the Baltic Sea War arc was about the weight of the countless pointless acts of violence that come in war, Thousand Year Voyage is focusing on the weight of the single act of violence that breaks peace. This chapter will mark the end of peace in Vinland and the start of Thorfinn's failure. the most frustrating part of all of this is how understandable Ivar's actions here are. We kind of pinned him as the guy who would just take a first strike, but here the context is kind of different. He genuinely believes Thorfinn is naive and unable to defend himself, and rather than letting Thorfinn die and usurping control of the settlement that way, he steps up and defends him. Ivar should not have done this, absolutely should not. But we can unfortunately well understand why he did. And Yukimura has made him seem reasonable and has given him the reason that sadly he's been looking for this whole time. So, overall thoughts of this chapter. I honestly just felt Yukimura's pain with this chapter. It's a necessary chapter that just hurts to read as a longtime Vinland Saga fan, and Yukimura is a man who addresses violence and can portray violence so well, but absolutely hates it. So I imagine this kind of gut-wrenching feeling is shared between us. Starting with this kind of light comedy and effective, peaceful discussion between the two groups was incredibly smart. And the goofy cover page of Bug-Eyes and Nisquaji'j does not prepare you for where this chapter will go. So it's absolutely perfect and just gets you completely shocked when things just suddenly turn for the worse. However, as always, I have one concern, and that's Misek and the vision. So, assuming Misek was not taking a peaceful bury the hatchet action here like I brought up before, then the first instance of violence was started by him and mostly due to the vision. I want to believe that Yukimura would not rely on mysticism to start conflict when he could create a more grounded and human conflict. So part of me wants to hold off and wait to see what exactly was going on with Misek in this chapter. If the idea of burying the hatchet is correct though, then the vision will fully serve its purpose and kind of come full circle as a means of addressing the audience by making it be our reason for believing this to be an attack just as Thorfinn did, just as the settlers did. It's us not understanding him and not understanding their culture. Like I have said previously though, the future sight ritual is a very real part of Mi'kmaq culture and is a necessary part of portraying their culture accurately. Due to the circumstances of Misek, during this ritual, he was lacking food and water, he's under the influence of like drugs, and he had these pre-existing fear of the settlers. And I think it's reasonable in a historic sense that he would see something in this vision that would make him more afraid and kind of solidify his fears and distrust. I think that is very realistic. What obviously isn't realistic is how accurate this vision is and how clear this vision is and how it does truly show the undeniable future. Now, addressing the reader with real history does serve a purpose. It lets us emotionally understand him and the weight of what will happen to his people in a way that a vague vision just could never convey. So, because of these reasons, I'm not entirely against the vision, and due to Vinland Saga's nature as a saga, I can forgive the dramatization of what is ultimately a historical ritual. So, again, hesitant on the vision. Probably always will be, but I see the uses, I see the benefits, and I see the ways this could still be how I want it to be, how I think it should be, where we're more focused on logical human human misunderstandings. And the idea of the burying the hatchet being misunderstood is one that I can really get behind. But again, one that I'm not confident will be the direction Yukimura takes. So, next chapter predictions. This chapter has marked the beginning of the end, so we will begin to see things fall apart next chapter. I don't think this will immediately spark fighting on both sides and turn this into an all-out battle. Instead, I think there will be some initial chaos that will eventually be brought under some kind of control. People are going to panic. That has to happen. There's no way people are going to just say, whoa, what happened there? They're going to be scared on both sides. Thorfinn may need to disarm Ivar himself, but even if he doesn't, he can't just allow Ivar to be free of consequence here for bringing the sword and using it. Thorfinn needs to kind of step up as a leader and bring consequences to Ivar, because now, again, although we can understand his actions, Thorfinn said, stay still, stay where you are, do not interfere, and Ivar still took this action himself. It can't be allowed if he wants to maintain good relations with the Gitpi tribe. And then Nisquaji'j will need to explain to her people what happened, and this will be a big test for her, because we saw in the chapter where she was exploring the settlement, Nisquaji'j's expedition, we saw that she kind of panics in that moment, where Ivar kind of aggressively yells at her when she's looking at the ship, and she gets freaked out, and then she runs into Cordelia and gets even more scared. So this will be a huge test for her character, where she needs to be in control, because she saw what happened, she heard what Misek was saying, and she knows that he initiated this. I also want Polmuk and Gitpi to take control here as well. I've come to really respect these two characters, Nisquaji'j included, from the native side of things. I've come to really respect the three of them, and I want them to, you know, try to take control and calm everyone down for the people that they can communicate with. I don't think this will ultimately result in the Gitpi tribe collectively going back on the understanding they came to in the beginning of this chapter, but I do think this incident will be the undeniable stain on their relationship between the tribe and the settlers that will begin to ultimately tear them apart. But again, I don't think this will be the end-all be-all. We still have other means of sparking conflict that have been up in the air for a long time now. The rats, which were brought back very recently, the alcohol, which was mentioned recently, and the narration specified how this affected the native tribes. And the milk brought by the settlers, which we know cannot really be handled by this dairy-free society. So I don't think that this incident will be the lone cause of the eventual failure of the village. But we'll have to wait till next month to see how all of this pans out. Again, this chapter just absolutely hurt me to read. I felt sick all day after reading it, so I'm just kind of in shock. As a longtime fan of Vinland Saga for these 3 years, I've known nothing but peace since I've caught up. I wasn't reading during the Baltic Sea War, and I caught up to the manga during Sailing West, so I have been kind of on this peaceful ride since then, and that has just made this absolutely gut-wrenching to read. So, incredible chapter. I can't wait to see what's next. So, I'll see you guys next month. Thank you for watching.